All right, welcome back everyone to another deep dive. Today, well, the Golan Heights. It's always in the news, isn't it?
Always seems to be.
And for good reason. I mean, it's the kind of place where geography, history, and politics all kind of crash together in a pretty fascinating way.
Yeah, an explosive way sometimes too, unfortunately.
Right. And that brings us to our jumping off point for this deep dive. A recent article about, well, it caught my eye, about Israel's plan to invest, get this, $11 million to double the population of the Golan Heights.
Ambitious plan.
That's a lot of money. So what's the story there?
Well, you have to understand, to really grasp the significance of this plan, you got to rewind the clock a bit. Back to 1967, the Six-Day War. That's when Israel captured the Golan Heights from Syria. And then in 81, they went a step further and officially annexed it.
But that annexation, it's not exactly universally accepted, right?
Exactly. That's the big sticking point. Most of the international community, they don't recognize it. The UN still considers it occupied Syrian territory.
So we've got this disputed territory, and Israel's pouring money into increasing the population. What's the strategy there? I mean, it can't just be about, liking the view from up there.
No. Definitely not just about the scenery. The Golan Heights, they're absolutely crucial for Israel's security. It provides a direct line of sight to Damascus and southern Syria.
Really?
Think of it as a giant early warning system.
Like a watchtower?
Yeah, like a watchtower. Any military activity, troop movements, anything suspicious, Israel's got a front row seat.
Okay, so it's like a natural fortress. Makes sense from a military point of view.
Yeah.
But are there other advantages, other reasons why it's so important for Israel to hold on to?
Oh, absolutely. Control of the Golan Heights also means control over vital water resources. It's a major source of fresh water for the whole region.
Water. Always a sensitive issue, especially in that part of the world.
Yeah. A huge part of the Jordan River, which, both Israel and its neighbors rely on, it originates there, in the Golan.
So if water scarcity is already a problem, holding on to a source like that's got to be a big strategic win.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. Water has been, it's been a major sticking point in past peace talks between Israel and Syria.
Mm-hmm.
The eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, it gets much of its water from the Golan Heights. It's always been a really tough issue.
Okay. And speaking of tricky issues, I remember, I think it was back in 2019, when the U.S., under President Trump, recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
Right.
But most of the world, they didn't follow suit, did they?
No, they didn't. That was a very controversial move, and it didn't change the overall kind of international stance. Most countries, especially in Europe, stuck with the UN resolutions, and Syria, of course, they continued to demand a full Israeli withdrawal.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this incredibly complicated situation. You've got Israel determined to hold on to the Golan, Syria demanding its return, and the international community largely siding with Syria's claim.
Sounds like a stalemate.
It is.
So in all of this, who actually lives in this contested area? Who are we talking about when we talk about this population growth?
Well, you have a mix of people living in the Golan Heights. A very interesting mix, actually. On one hand, you have about, let's say, around 31,000 Israelis, a lot of them involved in agriculture.
Agriculture? What do they grow up there?
Well, you might be surprised to learn the Golan Heights are actually known for their wineries. There's a thriving wine industry.
Winemaking, wow. That's not something you normally associate with a place known for conflict.
It's an interesting juxtaposition. But alongside the Israelis, there's another significant group, the Druze, about 24,000 of them.
Druze?
They're an Arab minority group with their own distinct religious beliefs.
Mm.
And most of the Druze in the Golan, they actually identify as Syrian.
So we've got Israelis who see it as, essential, Syrians who see it as their land, and this Druze population kind of caught in the middle. And you mentioned they have their own distinct religious beliefs. What are those beliefs, and how do they kind of factor into the Druze identity in this context?
Well, the Druze religion is it's kind of shrouded in secrecy. A lot of their practices are kept very private. But it's considered an offshoot of Islam, with influences from other philosophies, even other religions.
Fascinating.
They believe in reincarnation. And they have a strong emphasis on community and social justice. Now, because of those historical ties and this cultural affinity with Syria, many Druze in the Golan, they feel a really strong connection to that country, even though they've been living under Israeli rule for decades.
It must be a difficult position to be in. So what about Israeli public opinion? What do Israelis think about all this? This must be a sensitive topic, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's something that's fiercely debated within Israel.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the polls, they consistently show a very strong public support for retaining the Golan Heights.
Really?
A lot of Israelis see it as just too strategically important to give up, especially given, the instability, the ongoing instability in Syria.
But are there any groups in Israel that oppose holding on to the Golan? It just seems like such a challenging situation, with the international pressure and the internal dynamics with the Druze population.
Yeah, I mean, while the majority do support retaining the Golan, there are dissenting voices. Some argue that holding on to the territory, it actually fuels tensions with Syria, that it hinders the prospect for peace. They believe that a negotiated settlement, maybe involving some form of shared control or demilitarization, would be, better for Israel in the long run, both for security and for their standing on the world stage.
So you've got these strategic advantages, control of these essential resources, a mixed population with, these complex loyalties, and then you've got divided public opinion. It's a lot to unpack.
It is.
What about the economic side of things? Is that a factor in this decision to double the population?
Mm-hmm.
Is it just security, or is there an economic angle to this whole strategy?
It's definitely not just about security. There are economic calculations at play too. The Golan Heights, well, they're pretty fertile, believe it or not.
Really?
Oh yeah. I mean, we talked about the wine industry, but it goes beyond that. Think agriculture, tourism.
Tourism, okay.
You've got hiking trails, skiing in the winter months, and even some tech companies are starting to set up shop there.
Wow. So it's not just about building like a military outpost.
Yeah.
It's about building a thriving community up there.
That seems to be the long game.
To solidify Israel's presence, not just through military, but through a self-sustaining community.
Yeah.
Exactly. A vibrant economy, attract more residents.
But this can't be sitting well with Syria.
No.
What's their response to this whole development push?
Well, predictably, Syria has condemned it. They see it as a blatant violation of international law and a major roadblock to any future peace talks.
Yeah.
From their perspective, Israel they're tightening their grip on land that they believe is rightfully theirs.
So we have these competing claims.
Yeah.
Israel digging in, Syria protesting, and the international community, I guess, stuck in the middle.
Yeah.
So what happens next? What does the future hold for the Golan Heights? I mean, is there any path to resolving this? It's been going on for decades.
If I had a crystal ball, right?
Right.
But seriously, it's a very, very complicated situation.
Okay, but let's play geopolitical what if. What are some factors that could shape the future of the Golan?
Okay.
What should we be paying attention to?
All right. Well, I think the biggest one, the most obvious, is the situation in Syria itself.
As long as there's that instability, that conflict, it's really hard to imagine Israel, being willing to make any concessions on the Golan.
They see it as a buffer.
They see it as essential for their defense, a buffer zone.
So until there's some kind of stability in Syria, any talk of territorial compromise, it's off the table.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then you've got the international community stance.
Right.
The U.S. recognizing Israel's sovereignty, that was a big shift.
It was.
But most other countries, they remain opposed to the annexation. And that pressure on Israel, it makes it harder for them to fully integrate the Golan.
Okay, so even with the U.S. on their side, they're still facing a lot of pushback.
Definitely.
And we talked about public opinion within Israel being in favor of keeping the Golan. What about the Druze community?
Right.
How do they feel about all of this? How do they see their future?
It's a tough spot for them.
Yeah.
Deep ties to Syria, family, culture. But they've been living under Israeli rule for over 50 years now.
Right.
Some have chosen to embrace Israeli citizenship. They see it as the best way to secure their future. Others see it as a betrayal of their Syrian identity.
It's a loyalty versus practicality kind of dilemma.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it adds this whole other layer of complexity to the Golan Heights future.
So many layers here. We've got, the conflict in Syria. We've got the international pressure. We've got this internal struggle within the Druze community. Are there any other pieces of this puzzle that we haven't talked about yet?
There's one, it's often overlooked, but it could become the most critical factor of all.
What's that?
Water.
Right.
As climate change intensifies and water scarcity becomes an even bigger issue in the Middle East, well, control of the Golan Heights with its water resources, it's only going to become more important, more valuable.
More contested.
Absolutely. It could become a major, major flashpoint.
So it's not just about the land. It's not just about military strategy.
Right.
It's about control of a resource that's essential for survival.
Exactly. Water adds this whole other dimension to the conflict. Huge consequences for Israelis, Syrians, the whole region.
We've covered a lot of ground here. History, strategic importance, international perspective, human impact. But there's one big question we haven't really dug into: the peace process. Have there been any efforts to negotiate a solution to all of this? And where do those efforts stand today?
There have been attempts at peace negotiations in the past, but they've hit some pretty big roadblocks.
Like what? What kind of roadblocks?
Well, back in the 90s, I think it was during Ehud Barak's time as prime minister, there were some serious discussions with Syria about a land for peace deal.
So Israel would give back the Golan in exchange for a peace treaty. Is that what they were talking about?
That was the general idea, but they fell apart. One of the biggest sticking points, no surprise, was water.
Ah, there it is again.
Syria wanted full control of the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, which, it's a major source of fresh water for Israel. Israel wasn't willing to give that up.
Makes sense. So those talks were trying to, untangle this whole mess of issues, right? Historical grievances, security, and then you throw water into the mix.
Exactly. And it was just too much to overcome.
So have there been any other serious attempts to negotiate since then?
There have been some, sporadic efforts, but nothing like those talks in the 90s.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the civil war in Syria, that made any real negotiations impossible. And now, with Israel investing more in the Golan, the population growing, the possibility of a negotiated settlement seems even more distant.
So we're kind of stuck, aren't we? No progress toward peace, but not really any major escalation of tensions either.
It's a stalemate.
Yeah.
A precarious one, for sure. The underlying issues, they haven't gone away. And there are a lot of things that could really upset the balance. Renewed fighting in Syria, a leadership change in Israel or Syria, a water crisis. Any of those could reignite tensions over the Golan.
So everyone's just kind of holding their breath.
In a way, yeah.
We've talked a lot about the big picture here, but what about the people who live there in the Golan Heights? How do they deal with this reality, this uncertainty hanging over them?
It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitics and, forget that there are real people living their lives there. For a lot of Israelis living in the Golan Heights, life is actually fairly normal. They've got farms, businesses, families. They've got security from the Israeli military.
And they get to enjoy that incredible view.
The Golan is a beautiful place. But there's a fragility to that normalcy. The occasional rocket attack from Syria, the uncertainty of the future. What happens to them if there's ever a peace agreement? Well, they have to leave their homes.
It must be a lot to carry around, that kind of anxiety. What about the Druze? We've talked about the tough position they're in. How are they handling it?
It's a real balancing act for them. Many still have family in Syria, close ties. But they're also trying to build lives for themselves in the Golan. Some have taken Israeli citizenship. They see it as the most practical choice. Others refuse. They see it as a betrayal of their heritage. It's a lose-lose situation in a lot of ways.
It really highlights the human cost of this whole conflict, doesn't it? It's not just about lines on a map. It's about people's lives, their sense of belonging.
Exactly.
Well, this deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least. We've learned about the history, the strategic importance, the international perspective, the impact on the people who live there. It's clear that the Golan Heights is a place where, the past and the future are constantly colliding.
It really is. It's a microcosm, I think, of so many of the world's conflicts.
So as we wrap up here, what's the one thing you'd want our listeners to take away from this?
The Golan Heights, it's not just a dot on a map. It's not just a news story. It's a place where real people are living their lives, facing these incredibly tough choices. We have to remember that human dimension, I think, when we talk about these global issues.
I couldn't agree more. It's easy to get lost in the headlines, but there are always human stories behind them, stories that deserve to be heard and understood. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Golan Heights. It's been a fascinating and at times a sobering journey. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those minds engaged.